November 13, 1942. 0148 hours. Iron Bottom Sound, Guadalcanal. The night over Iron Bottom Sound exploded, not with waves but with fire. On the bridge of the Japanese destroyer Amatsukaze, Captain Tameichi Hara gripped the rail, mesmerized and horrified. USS San Francisco was unleashing 5-inch shells in such relentless waves that Hara would later write, "They are not aiming. They are simply filling the sky with metal." In less than 40 seconds, San Francisco would fire more shells than many Japanese destroyers carried for an entire mission. In Pearl Harbor, ammunition ships were loading the next shipment, 15,000 tons of shells, enough to replace what the fleet would expend that night 50 times over. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, naval planners agonized whether they could even spare 12 rounds per gun for upcoming operations. The mathematics of defeat were being etched in brass and cordite. Captain Hara would go on to become the only Japanese destroyer commander to serve from Pearl Harbor until the surrender, a survivor who watched the Imperial Navy's worldview shatter under the realization that, in industrialized conflict, empty magazines could decide battles more than frontline tactics. This is not merely a story of heroism, tactics, or courage, it's a story of industrial might versus resource scarcity. In 1942, during the Battle of the Java Sea, Allied forces, Americans, Australians, Dutch, and British, fired 1,619 rounds of 8-inch ammunition, scoring only 5 hits, 4 of which misfired. Nonetheless, their barrage continued regardless. The Japanese, though more precise, carried far fewer shells. Captain Hara noted with unease that the Allies fired as if shells were infinite. His own destroyer had fired nearly half its stored ammunition, 800 of 2,000 rounds, in just one engagement, while HMS Exeter alone expended more than most Japanese cruisers held in total. Victory, tactical as it was, came at unsustainable costs. Hara overheard his gunnery officer fretting, "Captain, we've used 40% of our battery. If this battle had lasted 2 more hours." The message was clear. Japanese ships could win fights but could not sustain campaigns. 6 months later, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japanese officers were stunned as American cruisers and destroyers maintained 4 straight hours of anti-aircraft fire. Their ships had just minutes worth of ammunition. Japanese ships operated under strict protocol, only firing at optimal range, conserving rounds. LT Commander Masataka Okamura's crews were trained to avoid overuse. Their magazines supported precisely 12 minutes of sustained fire, after which their ship was defenseless. Meanwhile, the Americans flew supply ships across the ocean to keep resupplying frontline vessels. By August 1942, the implications crystallized. At the Battle of Savo Island, Admiral Mikawa scored a tactical triumph, sinking 4 Allied heavy cruisers in just 33 minutes. Yet, Commander Toshikazu Omi later confessed, "We withdrew, not because we feared air attack, but because we had exhausted nearly all our ammunition. We had nothing left for a second fight." They drained their magazines, pausing to preserve ammo. Allied transports passed unharmed, not because of tactical restraint, but because Japanese ships could not afford to fire. This revelation was seismic. The industrial advantage, not battlefield valor, was the deciding force. The difference was industrial. The U.S. had become the arsenal of democracy. LT General Levin H. Campbell, Chief of Ordnance from 1942 to 46, recalled, "From Pearl Harbor to VJ Day, the industry ordnance team furnished 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, approximately 11 million tons of artillery ammunition, history stack exchange, millions of rifles, artillery pieces, and vehicles rolled off American assembly lines." Japan, by contrast, faced profound shortages. Even sacred temple bells were not spared. Nearly 45,000 Buddhist bancho were melted for casings. When Hara witnessed those glowing gun barrels at Iron Bottom Sound, he saw more than enemy fire. He saw steel-made authority. He watched empires forged not in courage, but in conveyor belts. Japan's resourcefulness, tradition, and bravery were eventually overwhelmed by the sheer volume of fire the U.S. brought to bear. That fateful night marked the beginning of the end. not because trades were lost, but because of the relentless, self-renewing tide of American ammunition. In the murky waters of February 1942, the Battle of the Java Sea unfolded under a tropical sky. The Allied fleet, American, British, Dutch, and Australian, bore down on Japanese forces with 1,619 rounds of 8-inch shells. Yet, despite this overwhelming volume, accuracy faltered. Only 5 shells struck home, 4 of them failing to detonate. The Allies continued to fire, bullet after bullet, as if the sea itself would yield to their ammunition alone. Captain Tameichi Hara, observing the aftermath, recognized a chilling reality. The Japanese war machine, though precise, was running empty. His own destroyer, Amatsukaze, entered the battle with 2,000 rounds and expended 800 in just one engagement. In sharp contrast, the British cruiser HMS Exeter alone discharged more shells than most Japanese heavy cruisers carried in total. That night, in the cramped wardroom, his gunnery officer whispered, "Captain, we've used 40% of our battery. If the engagement extended for just a few more minutes." The unspoken calculus was brutal. Japan could win tactical battles, but not the long war of attrition. Fast forward to May 1942, and the Pacific once again shook beneath conflict, this time at the Battle of the Coral Sea. In the sky, Japanese aviators crouched in dread as Allied cruisers and destroyers unleashed continuous anti-aircraft fire. Hours stretched on, and still the whirl of shells never ceased. On the bridge of Ryujo, LT, Commander Masataki Okamura's crew held their breath, trained to fire in strict short bursts only when aircraft breached 800 meters to conserve every round. Their magazines were loaded to support a mere 12 minutes of sustained fire, pageantry of economy rather than endurance. Meanwhile, in American-held ports, corridors brimmed with fresh shells. Their doctrine favored volume, suppression through coverage, an implicit message: if fire is price, factories are free. August 1942, a pivotal moment in the Pacific War. As U.S. Marines stormed Guadalcanal, Japan marshaled Admiral Mikawa's flotilla toward a crushing counterattack. In a stunning display, Mikawa's force sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers in 33 minutes, a display of pure tactical prowess. Yet, behind the facade of Japanese bravery lay a sobering truth. Commander Toshikazu Omi later revealed their withdrawal wasn't due to American air superiority. It was because their ships had run critically low on ammunition. They couldn't press further, not due to failing strategy, but failing supply lines. Savo Island etched itself into naval infamy. Japan could win swift, devastating victories, but could not sustain them. Behind every burst of shell fire lay a production line. The United States didn't just fight with courage, it fought with cartloads of brass. From 1942 to 1946, LT General Levin H. Campbell's Ordnance Department coordinated an armament surge that delivered 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, 11 million tons of artillery ammo, over 12 million rifles, 750,000 artillery pieces, and 1.5 million military vehicles. Concurrently, the Hastings Naval Ammunition Depot in Nebraska became a symbol of wartime production, responsible for over 40% of the U.S. Navy's munitions. Its construction alone required millions of dollars, thousands of buildings, and a workforce that doubled the population of the surrounding town. This was not mere supply, it was a logistical avalanche. In stark contrast, Japan's steel was directed inward, moral heritage sacrificed on the anvil of war. During the war years, nearly 45,000 temple bells, centuries-old objects of religious reverence, were requisitioned and melted down to create ammunition. These bells, once rung for peace and commemoration, were transformed into tools of destruction. In their tolling silence lay a grim testament to Japan's industrial collapse, a nation stripped of sacred relics to feed the war machine. For officers like Hara, witnessing this shift was more than tactical, it was existential. The Navy's core beliefs were eroding under waves of brass. Honor and precision had lost meaning when the opponent could afford chaos. Conversations in smoke-filled briefing rooms turned to grim jokes. They don't aim, they just fill the sky. It wasn't bravado, it was realization. As battles raged across the Pacific, Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal, it wasn't the quality of shells or courage that turned the tide, it was the quantity. By mid-1942, the gap between ideology and industrial capacity had become an abyss. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May that year wasn't just an aerial clash. It revealed how ammunition supply shaped fate. Japanese officers watched in disbelief as American cruisers and destroyers sustained hours of anti-aircraft barrage with no sign of pause, while Japanese destroyers operated on just 12 minutes of sustained AA fire before exhausting their supplies. The U.S. ships fired continuously, blanketing the sky in metal, proof their industrial engine could outgun even the most disciplined opponent. August 1942 brought even sharper reality at Guadalcanal. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's force executed a stunning blitz, sinking 4 Allied heavy cruisers in just 33 minutes. But Commander Toshikazu Omi later confessed the grim reason for withdrawal. Their ammunition was all but gone. Transports full of supplies passed by unscathed, not due to mercy, but because Japanese ships had simply run out of shells. That moment marked a shift. Japan's tactical wins were hollow unless matched by ammunition to sustain them. Fast forward to October 25, 1944. Escort carriers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3, led by USS Samuel B. Roberts D-413, were attacked by a heavily armored Japanese surface fleet near Samar. Despite being heavily outgunned, Roberts unleashed over 600 rounds of 5-inch ammunition in just 35 minutes, an astonishing feat for a destroyer escort. Their furious defense, combined with air support and smoke screens, helped repel the Japanese advance. Roberts eventually sank, but only after making every bullet count, an act of bravery buoyed entirely by ammunition superiority. The light cruiser USS Helena CL-50 also embodied relentless firepower. During the Pearl Harbor attack, she reportedly fired 375 rounds from her 5-inch guns, plus thousands of smaller caliber rounds, helping fend off further Japanese attacks. Later at Kula Gulf, Japanese officers credited Helena's near-automatic firing rate with overwhelming impact, believing it employed automatic weaponry beyond their experience. These feats were not bravado, they were industrial marvels. The United States produced 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, 11 million tons of artillery shells, 12 million rifles, and 1.5 million vehicles during the war. The Hastings Naval Ammunition Depot alone accounted for over 40% of the U.S. Navy's ammunition. This constant supply let U.S. ships fire without hesitation, turning skirmishes into wars of artillery volume. Japan's response was heartbreakingly symbolic. Nearly 45,000 Buddhist temple bells were melted down to produce ammunition. Sacred symbols of peace and reflection were reforged into instruments of war, underscoring how industrial scarcity forced Japan to sacrifice both material and spiritual heritage. Naval officers like Captain Hara endured a slow dread. Each clash revealed that tactical acumen alone couldn't prevail in a war powered by ammunition. The doctrine of conserving rounds and precise engagement crumbled when the enemy's supply trains never stopped. As one grim observation went, they didn't aim, they just emptied the sky. The disparity wasn't about courage or leadership, it was about shells per minute, production per factory. By late 1944 and into 1945, the war wasn't purely naval. U.S. forces moved ground armies quickly across Pacific Islands, sustained largely by logistical might. Battles on land served as parades of supply superiority. Japanese counterattacks faltered not due to strategy, but due to empty ammo stores and broken production lines. As the Allies prepared for Okinawa and the campaign toward Japan's home islands, the gulf in ammunition output became chasms. U.S. forces advanced on firepower. They didn't just move, they overwhelmed. Japanese defenders counted the few rounds they had, hoping precision would substitute wholesale volume. It didn't. By the time the war waned, Japan's dwindling war machine had survived not on myths, but on melted temple bells and unwavering courage. Yet, within Japan's official narrative, all mention of external aid or industrial failure was systematically erased. The nation was taught that victory relied entirely on national spirit and ingenuity, never on desperation and scarcity. In countless books, speeches, and naval journals, there was no mention of the 45,000 Buddhist temple bells melted for munitions, symbols turned into casings, prayers forged into bullets. This tragic sacrifice, confirmed by scholars through meticulous research on wartime medal collection, particularly from temple records and local testimonies, vanished from public memory. For veterans like Captain Tameichi Hara and his peers, the truth burned brighter in memory than any propaganda. In private conversations and later memoirs, they described the mounting dread of engaging in battles their ships were ill-equipped to sustain, not because of enemy fire, but due to empty magazines. They remembered nights at sea when each shell was precious, when American ships seemed fueled by the Atlantic itself. But speaking about ammunition shortages was dangerous. Some officers were silenced, accused of morale-sapping defeatism. Many refrained from sharing their experiences at all, becoming living archives of a buried struggle. State-affiliated publications recast history. Maps of Japan's Pacific offensives were replete with heroism, rarely hinting at the industrial erosion beneath the surface. Battle diagrams cunningly omitted Allied salvo frequency. Footage of naval engagements was edited to focus on Japanese ships, never the muzzle of a relentless American gun. The narrative was polished to reflect a self-sufficient warrior state, rising from adversity. The involvement of foreign shell factories, melted bells, or logistical collapse did not fit. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the corridors of U.S. naval depots buzzed like factories of fate. The Hastings Naval Ammunition Depot in Nebraska churned out more than 40% of the U.S. Navy's ordnance during WWII, an astonishing regional brand of industrial dominance. Every night on the seas, shells from Hastings and many more plants found their targets, sometimes fired in blind swaths, at invisible enemies, in affirmation that they could afford to fire. Visual archives confirmed the unspoken truth. Behind faded maps and grainy footage, there were scenes of emptied magazines, ammunition trucks rolling endlessly, and exhausted gunners reloading mid-battle. These moments were carefully excluded from school curriculums and public displays, a deliberate isolation of the wider context. Photos of temple bells being lowered into foundries were suppressed. Yet, in private homes and dusty attics, faded reels and aged photographs preserved the real story. The irony is as stark as a fired shell in night darkness. The massive sacrifices of Japanese material and morality were erased, while the American arsenal that overran them remained unseen in the same public memory. Japan taught its children that victory was supposed to be its own. In silence, however, veterans knew that every shot fired occasionally echoed a temple bell. As the Pacific War drew to a close, Japan faced not only physical defeat but cultural amnesia. For decades, the narrative taught at home celebrated valor and sacrifice while quietly burying the real engine of victory, industrial ammunition supremacy. In the aftermath, only fragments of the truth existed through memoirs of survivors like Captain Hara, declassified production records, and isolated archival photos. Historians eventually uncovered the scale of America's war-making power. 47 billion small arms rounds, 11 million tons of artillery shells, and thousands of weapons and vehicles manufactured courtesy of LT. General Levin H. Campbell's Ordnance reports. The Hastings Naval Ammunition Depot in Nebraska, which at its peak produced over 40% of the U.S. Navy's ordnance, including 40mm and 16-inch projectiles, bombs, and depth charges. These figures shattered the myth of Japan's self-sufficient war effort. Japan's wartime resource scarcity was so dire that nearly 45,000 Buddhist temple bells, centuries of spiritual heritage, were melted to produce shell casings. The haunting irony: objects once forged for devotion became weapons in a war they never wanted. Yet, within Japanese society, these memories faded into darkness, a hidden toll of a war that victory had robbed of nuance. Captain Hara survived the war, and his memoirs allowed a rare glimpse into the psyche of men who fought while watching their supply run dangerously low. Veterans like him carried their memories in silence, shaped by the guilt of knowing they fought bravely, but not equally well. American archives revealed only later the true scale of their output. The USS Samuel B. Roberts D-413 fired over 600 rounds in 35 minutes during the Battle off Samar, an extraordinary feat made possible only by relentless supply chains. The USS Helena CL-50, even after being torpedoed at Pearl Harbor, rapidly restored anti-aircraft fire, discharging 375 5-inch shells, 3,000 rounds of 1.1-inch, and 5,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammo. This was not heroism alone, it was machinery. In post-war Japan, textbooks glorified martyrdom and spirit. The missing cans of shells, melted bells, and factory lines were simply gone from the story. It took years, decades, for accurate historiography to emerge. Only when scholars accessed declassified files and veterans spoke candidly did the truth begin to surface. Japanese war gamers, history buffs, and later educators would face a reckoning. Ideals win battles only when backed by factories that supply those ideals with cold bullets. The Pacific War was not won by planners nor generals alone. It was won by logistics, by trains and forges, and assembly lines outpacing battle plans. While the valor of those on the gun deck remains unmatched, it was the fire raining from multiple calibers, born of Allied industrial might, that sealed the outcome. Japan, counting rounds, carefully metered each burst. America, overflowing with supplies, let battlefields drown in fire. This story is more than history, it's a lesson in the nature of power. When talk of fighting spirit excludes the power to supply that spirit, we risk forgetting that wars are not just physical, but economic and mechanized. Captain Hara's words, painted in flashes of gun muzzles over Iron Bottom Sound, still echo. They are not aiming, they are filling the sky with metal. As you close your eyes, imagine that night at sea. The sky torn asunder by relentless fire. One side firing in desperation, the other firing without constraint. No ideology, no bravery to compete with that. They needed factories, not just fighters. And that is why, with devastating simplicity, the Pacific War was decided not by courage, but by cartridges. If this shattered your understanding, there's more unseen history to unearth. Stay tuned.